Every town has a man. People stop noticing after a while. He is there in the morning when the streetlights are still on. He is there in the evening when the last truck pulls out of the feed store parking lot. He is there on Sundays, on holidays, on the kind of frozen January mornings when sensible people stay inside and curse the weather. But nobody sees him. Nobody thinks about him. Nobody mentions his name at dinner unless something breaks down and they need it fixed by tomorrow. In Colton County, Nebraska, that man was Harold Crane. For 30 years, Harold repaired broken tractors for farmers nobody else wanted to help. The ones with rust in the hydraulics and mice in the wiring. The ones held together with baling wire and stubbornness. The ones that smelled like diesel and desperation. Harold took them all. He never turned anyone away, never quoted a price before looking at the machine, and never once complained about the hours. He drove the oldest truck in town, a 1967 Ford F-100, with a cracked windshield and a passenger door that only opened from the outside. He paid cash for everything. Groceries at Sullivan's Market, fuel at the Conoco station on Route 8, parts from the salvage yard in Kearney when he could not find what he needed locally. Never borrowed, never financed, never upgraded. Some people called him cheap, others called him strange. A few of the younger farmers who did not remember the old days called him worse things than that, though never to his face, because half the county trusted him with machines worth more than the houses they lived in. Nobody ever called him important. Harold opened the garage every morning before the sun came up. 5:15 in summer, 5:30 in winter, no exceptions. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered for a few seconds before catching, and the smell of motor oil and cold concrete filled the space like a second atmosphere. He kept the shop clean in his own way. Tools hung on pegboard in the order he used them. Coffee can full of bolts on the left side of the workbench, logbook on the right, a calendar from First Harvest Bank that was 3 years out of date, but still showed the moon phases, which was all Harold cared about. And on the back wall above the shelf where he kept the transmission fluid, there was a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. A man standing in front of a farmhouse holding his hat in one hand and shielding his eyes from the sun with the other. The house behind him was small but well kept. The field behind the house stretched flat to the horizon. The man in the photograph was not smiling, but he did not look unhappy either. He looked like a man standing on something that belonged to him. Harold never talked about the photograph. Nobody asked. That Tuesday morning, Earl Dawson arrived at 6 with a John Deere 4020 that was leaking hydraulic fluid from somewhere Earl could not identify. Earl was 62, built like a fence post, and had been farming the same 300 acres his grandfather cleared in 1919. He talked the way most farmers talked when they came to Harold. Too much, too fast about everything except what was really wrong. Corn's down to $2.60 a bushel, Harold. $2.60. You know what my cost is? $3.10, maybe $3.20 if the fuel holds. And the bank, Lord, the bank calls every Tuesday now like it's a damn appointment. Martha can't sleep. I can't sleep. The kids say sell, but sell to who? Nobody's buying. Nobody's got money. Harold was underneath the tractor, lying on a creeper, looking at the hydraulic lines with a flashlight. He did not interrupt. He never interrupted. When a man needed to talk, Harold let him talk the same way he let an engine run until he could hear where the problem was. You think we'll make it through the winter, Harold, honestly? Harold slid out from under the tractor. He held up a cracked fitting. The rubber seal dried out and split. He said, "This pump, I'll replace the seal in the line, should hold you another 2 seasons." Earl waited for more. There was no more. Harold did not answer questions about the future. He answered questions about machines. After Earl left, Harold stood at the workbench and looked up at the photograph on the wall. The man in the picture. the farmhouse, the field. He looked at it for a long time, then turned back to the logbook and wrote down Earl's name, the date, and what he had repaired. Underneath, in smaller handwriting, he wrote something else. But that part of the logbook he kept angled away from customers. At noon, a truck pulled up outside the garage and Dale Perkins climbed out carrying 2 brown paper bags. This was not unusual. Dale Perkins had been bringing lunch to Harold's garage every day for 15 years. 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, 2 bottles of water. Sometimes a piece of pie if his wife had baked. The routine never changed because neither man wanted it to. Dale was 68, tall, thin, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as his fence posts. He farmed 400 acres north of town land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He was Harold's only friend, though neither of them would have used that word. They were simply 2 men who ate lunch together every day and did not feel the need to explain why. They sat on upturned oil drums in the shade of the garage door. Dale talked about his granddaughter who had just had a baby in Lincoln. Harold nodded. Dale mentioned the price of soybeans dropping again. Harold chewed his sandwich. Dale said the bank had called, but he told them to wait. Harold stopped chewing. Called about what? He asked. Dale waved it off. Nothing, just the usual. They want to restructure the loan. I told them I'd come in next month. But Dale's eyes moved to the left when he said it, and Harold noticed. Harold always noticed. He did not press the question. He did not offer advice. He simply filed the information in the same place he filed everything else behind his silence, where it could be retrieved later if needed. That was how Harold showed friendship. He did not intrude. He did not judge. He showed up. Every day for 15 years he showed up, and so did Dale. After Dale left that afternoon, Harold locked the garage and drove home. Home was a 1-story house on 2 acres at the edge of town. No decoration, no lawn ornaments, no porch swing. The house contained a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small living room with a single chair and a lamp. Harold did not own a television. He owned a radio that he rarely turned on and a shelf of books about soil composition, county water rights, and Nebraska railroad history that he had checked out from the public library so many times the librarian eventually told him to keep them. Harold sat at the kitchen table and unfolded a map. The map covered the entire surface of the table. It was a survey map of Colton County marked with property lines, parcel numbers, and ownership names that Harold had updated by hand over the years. Some names were crossed out and replaced with new ones. Some parcels were highlighted in yellow. Some had small notes written in the margins. Debt amounts, auction dates, mortgage holders. But Harold was not just tracking farmland. Along the edges of the map, he had drawn thin red lines following the old Union Pacific rail spur that cut through the southern part of the county. He had marked drainage easements in blue, highway access corridors in green, future road expansion zones which he had copied from public infrastructure planning documents at the county clerk's office in orange. Nobody read those documents. They were public record available to anyone who walked in and asked. But nobody asked because nobody thought about infrastructure planning in a county where the biggest news was who had the best corn yield. Harold thought about it. Harold had been thinking about it for 20 years. He studied the map the way other men studied box scores or stock tables, carefully, patiently looking for the pattern underneath the numbers. Who owned what? Who owed money? Who might lose everything next winter? And most importantly, which pieces of land sat on top of the invisible lines that would matter someday? The rail access, the drainage routes, the corridors where any future development would have to pass through. Harold closed the map, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He did not dream about money. Harold Crane had never dreamed about money. He dreamed about dirt, about the way it felt in your hand when it was good soil, heavy and dark and alive, about the way it looked when it was yours. He had been 14 years old the day he learned what it meant to lose it. The memory was not something Harold revisited voluntarily. It lived in him the way a fracture lives in a bone healed over but never gone aching when the weather changed. But the details were precise because Harold remembered everything. Summer 1942. The house on Packer Road, 4 miles east of town. His father, Virgil Crane, standing on the front porch in his work clothes, facing two men in suits who had driven out from the bank in a clean sedan that looked wrong on a dirt road. Harold watched from behind the screen door close enough to hear every word. Mr. Crane, the terms were clear when you signed. The bank has been patient. Virgil Crane was a big man, broad across the shoulders with hands that could bend a horseshoe. But that day he looked small. He knelt on the porch, scooped up a handful of dirt from the flower box his wife kept by the railing, and held it out like evidence. This land is my family's. My father broke this ground. You're taking everything. The man in the suit did not look at the dirt. The land belongs to the bank, Mr. Crane. It has since you signed the mortgage. 3 months later, the family moved into a rented room behind the laundry on Main Street. Harold's mother took in washing. Virgil said every night, I'll buy it back. Give me time. But there was no time. Virgil started drinking because the silence in a rented room sounds different from the silence on your own land. 1 year later, Virgil Crane was dead. The doctor wrote heart failure on the certificate. Harold knew it was something else, something the doctor did not have a word for. Harold was 15 when he started working at a repair shop in town. 16 when he could rebuild a transmission blindfolded. 20 when he opened his own garage. And from the very first dollar he earned, he saved. Not for a truck, not for a house, not for any of the things that other young men saved for. Harold saved for dirt, because his father had taught him one thing before he died, not with words, but with the way he lived and the way he broke. Dirt stays. Everything else disappears. This was the wound that built Harold Crane, and it would never be explained again, not in these words, not in this detail. From here forward, every decision Harold made would carry this weight silently, the way the earth carries water, deep underground, invisible, but always present. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, a tan Buick pulled into the garage parking lot and Margaret Hollis stepped out. She was 46 sharp, featured, dressed in a navy blazer that looked like it had never been within 50 feet of a tractor. She managed the Colton County branch of First Harvest Bank, which made her one of the most powerful people in the county, though power in Colton County mostly meant deciding whose loan got approved and whose did not. My air conditioning died on Route 8. She said not to Harold specifically, but to the air around Harold. She was already on her phone before she finished the sentence, walking in small circles on the gravel, her heels clicking. Harold looked at the Buick. He looked at Margaret. He wiped his hands on a rag and popped the hood. Margaret talked on the phone for 20 minutes while Harold worked. She did not lower her voice. She did not glance at him. He was furniture. He was the garage itself, functional and forgettable. Kevin, I need the Dawson file updated by Friday, and pull the foreclosure list for the quarterly review. 6 properties, maybe 7. Process them fast. I need this quarter's numbers clean before corporate runs their evaluation. Yes, all of them. No extensions. Harold's hands did not stop moving, but his jaw tightened. 6 families, maybe 7, losing everything. And for Margaret Hollis, it was a quarterly number, a line on a spreadsheet, a step toward the promotion she had been working toward for 3 years. Harold replaced the compressor relay, topped off the refrigerant, and closed the hood. Margaret paid in cash without looking at the receipt, got in the Buick, and drove away. She did not say thank you. She did not say goodbye. She did not know that Harold had heard every word. He stood in the garage doorway and watched the Buick disappear down Road 8. His right hand was still holding the wrench. His knuckles were white. She was doing to other people exactly what had been done to his father, and she did not even know their names. The first auction Harold attended was in October 1978. The Henderson Farm, 80 acres on the west side of the county. The land was not prime acreage. The soil was average, the drainage was poor, and the house needed a new roof. Most people who came to the auction came out of morbid curiosity or neighborly obligation. Nobody expected a bidding war. There were about 40 people standing in the yard. Bill Henderson and his wife stood near the barn, watching strangers appraise their life. Mrs. Henderson held a tissue but was not crying. She had finished crying days ago. The auctioneer started high and worked down. Nobody raised a hand. The price dropped again. Harold stood in the back, hat pulled low, hands in his coat pockets. When the price hit a number that made several people shake their heads in disbelief, Harold raised his hand. Once. 80 acres, cash. A few people looked at him. Someone whispered to someone else. The whisper was probably, "The mechanic, how does he have that kind of money?" But the question faded as fast as it came because nobody cared enough about Harold Crane to follow up. After the auction, Harold drove out to the Henderson property alone. He parked the F-100 at the edge of the south field and got out. He did not look at the house. He did not look at the barn. He walked to the far boundary and looked south toward the old rail spur that ran parallel to the county road about a quarter-mile away. The rail spur had not been used in years. The tracks were rusted, the ties were rotting, and the right-of-way was overgrown with prairie grass. To everyone in Colton County, it was dead infrastructure. But Harold had read the county transportation planning documents from 1975 and 1977. He knew the state had designated that corridor for potential future reactivation if commercial freight demand increased in the region. The land on either side of that corridor would become access land, the kind of land that developers, grain companies, or logistics firms would need if anything was ever built there. Nobody else in Colton County had read those documents. Harold stood at the fence line and nodded to himself. This was not cheap land. This was land that nobody else understood yet. The next week at Patsy's Diner on Main Street, Harold walked in to buy coffee to go. He never sat down at Patsy's. He was not part of any group, any booth, any morning circle of men who solved the world's problems over eggs and toast. Roy Sutter was at the counter. Roy was a big man, loud, the kind of farmer who measured his worth by the size of his equipment and the volume of his opinions. He turned around on his stool when Harold walked in. "Hey, Crane, heard you bought the Henderson place." "That right." Harold waited for his coffee. "That's right. With what money you been fixing tractors your whole life? Where does a mechanic get cash like that?" A few other men at the counter turned to listen. Harold could feel the room tighten, the way a room tightens when someone is being sized up. Harold took his coffee from the waitress, turned to Roy and said, "With the money I didn't spend on things I don't need." Roy's face went red. The sentence was not meant as an insult, but Roy heard one because Roy drove a brand new Chevy Silverado he had financed at 12%. Before Roy could respond, a voice from the end of the counter cut in. "That's enough, Roy. Leave the man alone." Glenn Harker, the county sheriff, was sitting at the far end of the bar with a plate of bacon in the morning paper. Glenn was 58, calm built like he had been poured into his uniform. He and Harold had gone to the same high school. They were not close, but they understood each other the way men do who have lived in the same place their entire lives without needing to explain themselves. Harold nodded to Glenn. Glenn nodded back. Harold left. Outside in the truck, Harold sat for a moment before starting the engine. He did not care what Roy Sutter thought. He did not care what anyone at Patsy's Diner thought. He cared about the map on his kitchen table and the plan he had been building for 2 decades. That night, Harold sat at the kitchen table with the map spread out under the lamp. He placed a penny on the Henderson property, marking it as purchased. Then he picked up a pencil and did what he had been preparing to do for years. He drew a circle. The circle encompassed the town of Colton and extended outward about 3 miles in every direction. It followed no road, no property line, no natural boundary. It followed logic. Harold's logic. Inside that circle sat the town, the main roads, the rail corridor, the drainage easements, the highway access points, and every corridor through which future development would have to pass. Whoever controlled the land along that circle controlled access to the town itself. Not the town's politics, not the town's businesses, the town's geography. Harold counted the parcels that sat on critical points along the circle. 7. 7 pieces of land, each one positioned on a rail crossing a drainage route, a highway access point, or a future expansion corridor. If he owned all 7, any company, any developer, any outside interest that wanted to build anything around Colton would have to come through him. He did not need to buy every acre in the county. He needed to buy the right 7. Harold looked at his savings ledger. 30 years of repairing tractors, living on almost nothing, putting every spare dollar into a savings account at a bank in Kearney, not First Harvest, because Harold did not trust local banks with his money. The total was substantial for a mechanic, enough for maybe 5 or 6 parcels at auction prices, maybe all 7 if prices kept falling. And prices were falling, fast. Harold picked up the pencil again and wrote a number next to each of the 7 parcels. Estimated auction price. Estimated timeline to foreclosure based on what he knew about each owner's debt situation. He knew their debt situations because they told him every morning in his garage while he fixed their machines. They told him everything. Harold closed the map. He had just made the most dangerous decision of his life. He was going to bet every dollar he had saved in 30 years on 7 pieces of dirt that nobody else wanted. If he was wrong about the infrastructure corridors, if the state never reactivated the rail spur, if no developer ever came to Colton County, he would be an old mechanic who owned worthless farmland and had nothing left. If he was right, he would own the ground beneath the future of the entire county. And nobody would know until it was too late. Over the next 5 years, Harold bought land the way water fills cracks in stone, slowly, silently, following the path of least resistance. In 1979, he bought 60 acres north of town from the Morrison family estate auction. The Morrisons had no heirs willing to farm, and the land sat on the main drainage easement that served the entire north side of the county. Harold paid $12,000 in cash, nearly half his savings at the time. His hand trembled when he signed the check. It was the first time he had ever committed that much money to anything. In 1981, he bought 45 acres on the east side from Barb Kingsley. Barb was 71, and her husband was in the hospital in Grand Island with emphysema. She needed money for medical bills. Harold did not buy through an auction. He drove to Barb's house, sat at her kitchen table, and made an offer at fair market value, not below, not above, fair. Barb looked at him with wet eyes and said, "You're the only person who came out here and didn't try to make me feel stupid for selling." Harold said, "You're not stupid, Mrs. Kingsley. You're taking care of your husband." He paid in cash. Barb signed the deed. Harold drove home with the 45 acres that completed the eastern segment of his circle. In 1983, the big one, 100 acres on the south side running parallel to the highway access road. This was the most critical parcel on his map, the one that controlled the primary commercial approach to the town. At the auction, a speculator from Lincoln bid against Harold. The price climbed higher than Harold had planned for. Harold calculated silently, then pulled his hand down. He could not afford it without wiping out his reserves completely. He drove home that afternoon feeling something he rarely felt: doubt. But 2 months later, the speculator from Lincoln defaulted on his payment. The land went back to auction. Harold bought it the second time for less than he would have paid the first time. He learned something that day that he would carry for the rest of his life. Patience was not just a personality trait. Patience was a financial strategy. By the end of 1984, Harold Crane had purchased 6 of the 7 parcels on his map. 6 pieces of land positioned at every critical access point around the town of Colton: rail corridor, drainage route, highway approach, future expansion zones. The circle was almost complete. Almost. The 7th parcel was 400 acres on the north side of town. It sat on the intersection of the old rail spur and the county road, the single most valuable strategic position on the entire map. Whoever owned that land owned the key to the circle. Without it, there was a gap that any sufficiently resourced company could exploit to bypass Harold's entire position. Harold knew exactly who owned the 7th parcel: Dale Perkins, his only friend. Harold sat in the garage after closing time, the lights off, the only illumination coming from the small lamp on his workbench. The map was open in front of him. His finger rested on the north parcel. Dale's land, 400 acres of Perkins family soil, worked by 3 generations, maintained with pride and stubbornness and love. Dale was in debt? Harold knew this because Dale had told him in pieces over 15 years of lunches. Not all at once, never directly, but Harold heard it in the things Dale did not say, in the way Dale changed the subject when the bank came up, in the way Dale's truck got older and his equipment got louder and the repairs got more frequent. Harold stared at the map. The 7th parcel, the one piece that would complete the circle, and it belonged to the one man who had shown him kindness every day for 15 years. Harold closed the logbook, turned off the lamp, sat in the dark for a long time. Outside, the Nebraska wind pushed against the garage walls. Inside, Harold Crane sat with a decision he was not ready to make and a plan that would not wait. By the end of 1984, Harold Crane quietly controlled farmland surrounding nearly the entire town of Colton from every direction. He was missing one piece, and that one piece belonged to the only person in the world who still brought him lunch. The winter of 1984 arrived early in Colton County. By the first week of November, the fields were frozen solid, and the sky had turned the color of old pewter, low and heavy and unforgiving. Farmers who had hoped for a late harvest were finished hoping. The corn that was still standing would stay standing until spring, worthless, a monument to a year that had promised nothing and delivered less. Harold opened the garage at 5:15 every morning, same as always. But the men who came through the door were different now. They were not bringing machines to be repaired. They were bringing themselves. Earl Dawson arrived on a Tuesday not with a tractor, but on foot. He had walked 2 miles from his farmhouse because his truck was out of gauge and he could not afford to fill it. Harold saw him coming up the road through the garage window, a 62-year-old man in a canvas jacket and boots that were splitting at the soles, walking with his head down against the wind. Earl did not say good morning. He sat down on the oil drum, where Dale usually sat during lunch. He put his hands on his knees. He stared at the floor. "They sent the letter," he said. Harold was replacing a clutch plate on a Massey Ferguson. He did not stop working, but his hands slowed. 30 days, Earl said. "The bank says 30 days. Then it's done." Harold slid out from under the tractor and sat up on the creeper. He looked at Earl. The man's face was the color of ash. His lips were moving slightly, rehearsing something he had not yet been able to say out loud. 4 generations, Harold. My grandfather cleared that land with a mule and a breaking plow. My father built the barn with lumber he milled himself. I was born in the back bedroom. My children were born in the back bedroom. Earl's voice cracked on the word children, and then something broke loose about him that had been held in place by decades of prairie stubbornness. Earl Dawson put his face in his hands and wept. Harold set down the wrench. He stood up. He walked over to the oil drum and put his hand on Earl's shoulder. He did not say it will be all right because it would not be all right. He did not say I'm sorry because sorry did not change anything. He stood there with his hand on the shoulder of a man who was losing everything, and he felt the weight of something he could not fix with tools. Because Harold knew this moment. He had lived it. He had been 14 years old, standing behind a screen door watching his father kneel in the dirt. And now, 40 years later, the same scene was replaying in his garage with a different man and the same banks and the same outcome. The only difference was that this time Harold had money. He had savings. He had the ability to act. But Earl's land was not on the map. Earl's 300 acres sat in the middle of the county, away from the rail corridor, away from the highway access, away from every strategic point Harold had identified. Buying Earl's land would not complete the circle. It would only drain the funds Harold needed for the one parcel that mattered. Harold hated himself for thinking that way. He hated that his mind went to the map before it went to the man. But that was the truth of Harold Crane, a truth he would never speak aloud. The plan was bigger than any single friendship. The plan was 30 years old. The plan was his father's ghost, demanding that the land never be lost again. Earl wiped his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed. He stood up. Sorry, Harold, I didn't mean to carry on like that. Harold said, You don't need to apologize for that, not ever. Earl nodded and walked back out into the cold. Harold watched him go, then sat down at the workbench and stared at the wall for a long time. Not at the photograph, at the wall itself, at nothing. That was the morning Harold Crane understood something about himself that he had been avoiding for 20 years. He could not save everyone. He could not even save most people. All he could do was make sure the land did not end up in the hands of strangers who would strip it bare and leave. It was not enough, but was all he had. The following week inside First Harvest Bank, Margaret Hollis convened a staff meeting in the small conference room behind the lobby. 4 employees sat around the table. Margaret stood at the whiteboard with a printed spreadsheet. 12 accounts in default. I want all 12 processed before the end of the quarter. No extensions, no restructuring. Corporate is evaluating branch performance in January, and this branch is going to show clean numbers. Kevin Marsh at 26, youngest loan officer, raised his hand slightly. Mrs. Hollis, the Dawson account, has been current for 8 consecutive years before this delinquency. If we offered a 6-month forbearance period, the chance of recovery is actually... Margaret cut him off. Time doesn't pay interest, Kevin. Process it. Kevin looked at the spreadsheet. Each line was a name. Each name was a family. He had grown up with some of their children. He put his pen down and said nothing more. That same afternoon, Hank Leary kicked open the front door of First Harvest Bank hard enough to rattle the glass. Hank was 55, red-faced, built like a hay bale, and he had received his foreclosure notice that morning. He crossed the lobby in 4 strides and slammed both fists on the reception counter. Where is she? Where is Hollis? The teller pressed the panic button under the counter. Margaret appeared in her office doorway, composed hands clasped in front of her. Mr. Leary, I understand you're upset, but this is not the way to... Upset? My family has been in this county since before your bank had a name. You sit in that office and sign papers that destroy people's lives, and you call it business. What do you call it when it happens to you? Margaret did not flinch. I call it the terms of a contract you signed voluntarily. Glenn, could you come in, please? Glenn Harker was already walking through the front door. Someone at the diner had seen Hank heading toward the bank and called the sheriff's office. Glenn put his hand on Hank's arm gently. Come on, Hank. This isn't going to help. Nothing helps, Glenn. That's the whole point. Glenn guided Hank outside. On the sidewalk, Hank stood breathing hard, fists still clenched. Glenn said quietly, I know it doesn't feel like it, but there might be other options. Talk to a lawyer before you do anything else. Hank laughed. It was not a happy sound. A lawyer? With what money, Glenn? Across the street, Harold Crane stood on the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, a bag of bolts in his hand. He had seen the whole thing. Hank the counter, the fists, Margaret in her doorway, Glenn leading a broken man out of a building that had just taken everything from him. Harold turned and walked back to the garage. He did not intervene. He had learned long ago that the system could not be fought from the front. It could only be outmaneuvered from the side. The Greyhound bus arrived in Colton at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. Tommy Crane stepped off with one backpack and a face that looked like it had not smiled in weeks. He was 19, lean, dark-haired, with his mother's sharp features and his dead father's restless eyes. Harold's older brother, Ray, had died in a grain auger accident when Tommy was 11. Tommy's mother had remarried and moved to Iowa. Tommy had gone to college in Omaha on a partial scholarship that ran out after 3 semesters. Harold picked him up at the bus stop in the F-100. They drove to the house in silence. Harold showed Tommy the spare room, which contained a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the backyard. Tommy set his backpack on the bed and said, Thanks, Uncle Harold. Harold nodded and went back to the garage. For the first 2 weeks, Tommy slept late, ate what Harold left in the refrigerator, and wandered around the town looking at a place he remembered from childhood visits, but no longer recognized. The storefronts were half empty. The feed store had reduced its hours. The equipment dealer on Route 8 had a lot full of repossessed machinery that nobody could afford to buy. Tommy was smart. He noticed things quickly. On his 14th night in the house, he came into the kitchen to get water and found Harold at the table with the map. Harold folded it quickly, but not quickly enough. What's that? Tommy asked. Work, Harold said. Tommy had seen enough. Property lines, parcel numbers, Harold's handwriting in the margins. He did not ask more that night. But 3 days later, Tommy was helping organize the back shelves of the garage when he found the drawer. It was not locked. It had never needed to be because nobody ever looked. Inside were documents, deeds, 6 of them. Each one for a different parcel of land in Colton County, each one signed and recorded, each one listing Harold Crane as the owner. Tommy counted the acreage. Then he counted again. Then he walked to the front of the garage where Harold was adjusting a carburetor and set the documents on the workbench. Uncle Harold. Harold looked at the deeds. He looked at Tommy. He said nothing. You fix tractors for people who are losing their farms, and then you buy their land. Tommy's voice was not angry yet. It was confused, which was worse because confusion could go in any direction. How is that different from what the bank does? Harold put down the carburetor tool. He turned to face his nephew Folly, and when he spoke, his voice was lower and heavier than Tommy had ever heard it. The bank buys to sell, I buy to keep. Keep for who? For you. Harold held Tommy's gaze for 3 seconds, then turned back to the carburetor. The conversation was over. But Tommy had planted something in the garage that afternoon that would not be removed. A question Harold had asked himself 1,000 times in the dark, now spoken aloud by someone who shared his blood. Was he saving the land, or was he profiting from the pain of people who trusted him? Harold did not answer because Harold did not know. Margaret Hollis brought her Buick back to the garage on a Wednesday. This time the alternator was failing. While Harold worked, Margaret stood in the parking area and made a phone call that she did not bother to lower her voice for because Harold Crane was a mechanic and mechanics did not matter. Richard, I got a call from a group out of Omaha. Investment firm, large scale. They're asking about agricultural land in the county, specifically parcels near transportation corridors. If they come in, prices go up, and our foreclosure inventory becomes very attractive. Push the timeline on the remaining defaults. I want those properties in the bank's portfolio before anyone else starts buying. Harold heard every word. His hands kept moving, but inside his chest something shifted the way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake, slow and deep and irreversible. An investment group from Omaha. Looking at land near transportation corridors, the exact corridors Harold had been mapping for 20 years. Someone else had seen what he had seen, and they had more money than he would ever have. That night, Harold sat at the kitchen table and did the math he had been dreading. He had 6 parcels. He needed 7. The 7th Dale's 400 acres was the keystone of the entire position. Without it, there was a gap in the circle on the north side, a gap large enough for a well-funded company to drive through and access the town without touching Harold's land. If the Omaha group arrived before Harold acquired the 7th parcel, everything he had built over 20 years would be worthless. 6 pieces of a 7-piece puzzle, close to everything and worth nothing. Harold needed Dale's land, and Dale's land was about to go to auction. The timing was not coincidence. It was the math of crisis. Dale had been falling behind for years in the bank. Margaret's bank had just accelerated the foreclosure timeline to make their inventory attractive for the Omaha buyers. The system was working exactly as it was designed to work. Money flowed upward, land flowed outward, and the people who had built the county were pushed aside like fence posts in a flood. Harold closed the map. He knew what he was going to do. He also knew what it would cost. Dale Perkins came to the garage on a Monday morning in February 1985. He was not carrying lunch. His face was gray and his hands hung at his sides like they did not know what to hold on to anymore. Bank took the farm, he said. Auctions in 3 weeks. Harold was standing at the workbench. He stopped moving. Dale sat down on the oil drum. He did not cry. He was past that. He spoke in a flat voice, the voice of a man who had already grieved and was now dealing with logistics. Harold, I need to ask you something I've never asked anyone. I need to borrow money, enough to buy the land back at auction. I'll pay you back. You know I'm good for it. 5 years, 10 years, whatever it takes. The garage was silent except for the wind pushing against the metal walls. Harold knew exactly how much money he had. He knew exactly how much Dale's land would sell for at auction. He knew that if he lent Dale the money, Dale would buy his own land back, and Harold would lose the 7th parcel. The circle would remain broken. The Omaha group would find the gap. 20 years of planning, 30 years of saving every sacrifice Harold had ever made, and all of it would collapse because he chose friendship over strategy. Harold also knew something else. He knew that what he was about to say was a lie, the first and only lie he would tell in this story. I don't have enough to lend you, Dale. I'm sorry. He had enough. He had exactly enough. But if he gave it to Dale, he would not have enough to buy the land himself. Dale looked at Harold for a long time. He nodded slowly the way a man nods when he is accepting something he does not believe but is too exhausted to challenge. He stood up, put his hat on, and walked out of the garage. He did not bring lunch the next day, or the day after, or the day after that. The auction was held on a frozen Saturday in early March. About 30 people stood in the yard of the Perkins farmhouse, breath rising in white clouds. Dale was there. His wife was not. She had gone to stay with their daughter in Lincoln because she could not watch. The auctioneer called the opening bid. Nobody moved. The price dropped again. Harold raised his hand. 400 acres, cash. The crowd murmured. A few people who knew both men looked back and forth between Harold and Dale, trying to understand what they were seeing. The mechanic buying his best friend's farm. It did not make sense. Or it made a terrible kind of sense that nobody wanted to examine too closely. Dale stood at the edge of the crowd. He watched Harold sign the papers. He watched the auctioneer hand over the deed. And then Dale walked over to Harold, slowly, deliberately stopping 2 feet in front of him. 15 years, Dale said. His voice was quiet, but every person in that yard heard it. 15 years I brought you lunch every day, sat with you when nobody else would, and you told me you didn't have the money. He paused. Then you buy my land with cash. Harold did not look away. He did not offer an explanation. He did not say it was for a greater good or that Dale would understand someday. He stood there and received the words because he deserved them. Dale looked at the ground between them. He spat once deliberately at Harold's feet. Then he turned and walked to his truck and drove away. Harold stood in the frozen yard, holding a deed to 400 acres and feeling nothing he could name. The circle was complete. 7 parcels. Every strategic access point around the town of Colton. 20 years of planning finished in a single morning. He had won everything on the map and lost the only man who had ever brought him lunch. The next 3 days, Harold did not open the garage. For the first time in 30 years, the fluorescent lights did not come on at 5:15. The door stayed locked. The phone rang and nobody answered. Inside the house, Harold sat at the kitchen table. The map was spread out in front of him, all 7 parcels now marked. The circle was closed. Every corridor, every access point, every strategic position, all of it belonged to him. He should have felt satisfaction. He felt hollow. On the table beside the map was a bottle of Jim Beam. Harold had bought it 6 years ago for reasons he never examined. It had sat unopened on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet behind the coffee filters, untouched. Harold had not taken a drink of alcohol since he was 17 years old. Not since the day he buried his father. Not since he made a promise to himself that he would not follow Virgil Crane into the bottle. The cap was off. The seal was broken. The whiskey sat in the glass amber and still catching the light from the kitchen lamp. Tommy came home at 10 that night and found his uncle sitting in the dark. The kitchen light had been on when Tommy left that morning. It was off now. The only light came from the street lamp outside the window, casting a pale stripe across the table. Tommy saw the bottle. He saw the glass. He saw his uncle's face, and for the first time since arriving in Colton, Tommy felt afraid. Not afraid of Harold, afraid for him. Uncle Harold. Harold did not look up. Tommy sat down across the table. He looked at the glass. It was full. It had not been touched. Harold had been sitting in front of it for hours, staring at the thing that had killed his father, and he had not taken a single drink. Tommy did not know the full story. He knew pieces. His mother had told him that Grandpa Virgil drank himself to death after losing the farm. He knew Harold never touched alcohol, and now he understood with the sudden clarity that comes from seeing someone you love at the edge of something that this was not about whiskey. This was about Harold asking himself whether he had become the thing he swore to fight. Virgil Crane lost the land, and it destroyed him. Harold Crane kept the land, and it was destroying something else. The difference between the two men was smaller than Harold wanted it to be. Tommy reached across the table and picked up the glass. He walked to the sink and poured it out. Then he put the cap back on the bottle and set it on the counter. "You should open the garage tomorrow," Tommy said. "People need their tractors fixed." Harold looked at his nephew. Something passed between them that neither could articulate. Then Harold nodded. The next morning, the lights came on at 5:15. Two farmers were already waiting outside with broken equipment. Harold opened the door, picked up a wrench, and went to work, because that was the only thing he had ever known how to do when everything else was falling apart. Spring arrived in Colton County the way it always did, slow and muddy and smelling of thaw. But this spring brought something the county had not seen before. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into town on a Tuesday morning and parked in front of the county courthouse. The license plates were from Douglas County, Omaha. Heartland Meridian Corporation. The name was printed on a banner they hung inside the courthouse meeting room next to a large format map of Colton County that covered most of the wall. The map had colored zones: red for acquisition targets, blue for proposed construction, green for transportation corridors. It looked professional. It looked expensive. It looked like the future. Russell Tate stood at the front of the room. He was 50, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than most of the trucks parked outside. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who was accustomed to walking into small towns and buying them. Ladies and gentlemen, Heartland Meridian is committed to bringing economic revitalization to Colton County: industrial storage facilities, modernized grain terminals, commercial trucking routes connecting you to regional markets, jobs, infrastructure, growth. About 60 people sat in folding chairs. Some leaned forward, hungry for the promise of money. Others sat back with their arms crossed, recognizing the sound of a man who planned to take more than he gave. A few whispered to each other. Margaret Hollis sat in the second row next to a Heartland Meridian associate, nodding at every point. Harold Crane sat in the last row, hat on hands in his lap. Tommy sat next to him. Tommy was looking at the map on the wall, the red zones, the acquisition targets. He had seen Harold's map enough times to recognize the geography. And as Russell Tate pointed to one red zone after another, describing the land Heartland Meridian planned to purchase, Tommy felt his stomach drop. He leaned toward Harold and whispered, "Those red areas." Harold said nothing. His eyes moved from one red zone to the next: west side, north side, south highway access, east drainage corridor, rail spur crossing. He had been right about all of it. Every parcel he had chosen, every strategic position he had identified by reading dusty planning documents. In the county clerk's office, every bet he had placed with 30 years of savings. All of it was now being validated by a multi-million-dollar development company that had arrived at the same conclusions using satellite imagery and market analysts and teams of consultants. The difference was that Harold had gotten there first, 20 years first. After the presentation, the room buzzed with conversations. Farmers approached Russell Tate with questions about prices and timelines. Margaret Hollis shook hands with the Heartland Meridian team like old colleagues. The energy in the room was a mixture of hope and suspicion, the unique cocktail of emotions that small towns produce when big money walks through the door. Russell Tate noticed Harold near the back of the room. He straightened his tie, walked over, and extended his hand with the practiced warmth of a man who shook 100 hands a week. "Thanks for coming out, sir. Appreciate the community's interest." He glanced at Harold's work boots and oil-stained jacket. "We may eventually be interested in your small parcel outside town. Could be a nice payday for you." Harold looked at Russell's hand. He did not shake it. He said, "Which parcel?" Russell smiled. He gestured toward the wall map. "Well, the west side area there near the rail line." Harold nodded. Russell pointed north. "And possibly the north fields near the county road intersection." Harold nodded again. Russell pointed south. "And the highway access corridor. We'll need right-of-way clearance there." Harold nodded a third time. The smile on Russell Tate's face began to change. Not disappearing exactly, but restructuring itself the way a building restructures when the foundation shifts. "You seem familiar with the area," Russell said, his voice slightly different now. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded document, then another, then another, then another. He held them in one hand, a stack of county recorded deeds, each one stamped, each one signed, each one listing Harold Crane as the sole owner of a parcel that Heartland Meridian had marked in red on their expensive wall map. Rail access, storage road approaches, drainage corridor, highway entry, north intersection, south corridor, east easement, 7 parcels, 7 deeds, 7 pieces of the only puzzle that mattered. Russell Tate stopped talking. The 2 associates who had drifted over to listen stopped talking. Margaret Hollis, who had been approaching with a brochure, stopped walking. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in waves, the way a lake freezes, starting at the edges and moving inward as one person after another turned to look at the mechanic holding a stack of papers that had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar development plan. Harold folded the deeds and put them back in his coat. He put his hat on. He turned toward the door. Russell Tate said, "Wait, how much of that land is yours?" Harold stopped. He did not turn around. He said over his shoulder the quietest sentence anyone in the room had ever heard carry so much weight. "Enough." He walked out. Tommy followed 2 steps behind, looking at his uncle with an expression that was not admiration and was not fear. It was something between the two, the look of a young man who had just realized that the quiet person he had been living with was the most dangerous man in the room, and had been for 30 years, and nobody had known it. They got in the F-100. Harold started the engine. Tommy sat in the passenger seat, staring through the cracked windshield at the courthouse where a room full of people were still trying to understand what had just happened. "Uncle Harold," Tommy said. Harold pulled out of the parking space. "What are you going to do?" Harold drove toward the garage. The sun was going down over the fields, the ones that belonged to him and the ones that did not. And from the road, they all looked the same, flat and endless and patient. He did not answer the question, because the answer was something that Heartland Meridian, Margaret Hollis, Russell Tate, and every person in that courthouse was about to discover. And none of them were going to like it. The news spread through Colton County the way fire spreads through dry wheat. Not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, jumping from house to house, phone line to phone line, booth to booth at Patsy's Diner, until by Thursday morning there was not a single person in the county who had not heard some version of the story. The mechanic owns the land, all of it, every direction. He's been buying for years and nobody knew. But nobody could agree on what the story meant. At the grain elevator, 2 men loading trucks argued about whether Harold was a genius or a con man. At the church on Sunday, Reverend Cullen mentioned stewardship of the land in his sermon, and half the congregation thought he was talking about Harold, while the other half thought he was talking about Heartland Meridian. At the feed store, Roy Sutter, who 6 years earlier had confronted Harold about the Henderson purchase, leaned against the counter and told anyone who would listen, "I always knew that man was up to something. You could see it in his eyes." Nobody pointed out that Roy had spent those 6 years calling Harold a junk collector who got lucky at one auction. The reactions organized themselves into 3 camps within the first week. There were those who respected Harold, mostly older farmers, who understood what it meant to hold land through hard times and recognized a kind of stubborn brilliance in what he had done. There were those who resented him, farmers who had sold their land at auction prices and now suspected that the quiet mechanic who fixed their machines had been waiting for them to fail. And there were those who simply wanted something from him. People who smelled money the way certain animals smell water from a distance instinctively, and who began showing up at the garage with handshakes and proposals and offers of friendship that had not existed 2 weeks earlier. Harold ignored all 3 groups equally. The first to arrive was Carl Brandt, who ran the equipment dealership on Route 8. Carl drove to the garage on a Thursday morning in a truck that was too clean to need service. He sat in the waiting area for 20 minutes before Harold acknowledged him, then launched into a proposal involving a joint venture to sell farmland to out-of-state investors at premium prices. Harold let Carl talk for 6 minutes, then said, "I don't sell land, Carl." Carl left looking confused as though Harold had spoken in a foreign language. The second was a woman named Deirdre Ross, who had sold her family's 40 acres at auction in 1982 and moved into a trailer on the edge of town. She came to the garage not with a proposal, but with a question. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, chin raised. "My land, the 40 acres on the east side, did you buy it?" Harold shook his head. "No, that went to a speculator out at Kearney." Deirdre studied his face. "But you bought other people's land while they were going under." "I bought land at public auction at the price that was offered, same as anyone could have done. Anyone with value, which nobody had, except you." She stood there for another 10 seconds, then turned and left. She did not slam the door. She did not curse. She simply left with her jaw tight and her eyes carrying a judgment that Harold could feel on his back long after she was gone. That was the part nobody talked about. The people who celebrated Harold's brilliance were not the people who had lost their farms, and the people who had lost their farms were not celebrating. Tommy watched these encounters from the back of the garage. He said nothing, but each one added weight to the question he had already asked his uncle and that his uncle had not been able to answer. First Harvest Bank sent him a letter. Harold recognized Margaret Hollis's signature at the bottom. The letter expressed the bank's deep appreciation for Mr. Crane's long-standing relationship with our institution and offered enhanced financial services tailored to clients with significant agricultural holdings. Harold read the letter, once folded it, and used it to level a wobbling leg on the workbench. But the letter told him something useful. Margaret had changed her calculation. A week ago, Harold Crane was invisible to her. Now he was a client worth courting, which meant the bank had concluded that Harold's land position was real substantial and unlikely to be dislodged by legal challenge. If Margaret thought there was a weakness in his paperwork, she would not be writing friendly letters. She would be writing subpoenas. That knowledge would matter very soon. Russell Tate returned to the garage on a Wednesday, 11 days after the courthouse meeting. This time he came without associates and without the banner. He drove a rented sedan instead of a black SUV. He was dressed more casually, khakis and a button-down, as if trying to look like someone who belonged in a small town. The effect was unconvincing. He stood in the garage doorway for a moment, watching Harold work on a combine header. Harold did not look up. "Mr. Crane, I'd like to start over, if that's all right." Harold continued working. Russell walked in and sat on the stool near the workbench. He had brought a laptop, which he opened on his knee. On the screen was a spreadsheet showing numbers that represented in abstract form the future Harold's land could generate if converted from frozen dirt into commercial real estate. "Let me be straightforward with you," Russell said. "Heartland Meridian has invested 14 months of planning and significant capital in this project. We've surveyed the corridors, negotiated preliminary agreements with the State Transportation Department, and secured financing for Phase 1 construction. The only variable we did not anticipate was you." Harold was adjusting a bearing assembly. He did not respond. "We're prepared to offer a comprehensive package, long-term lease agreements for the parcels we need for transportation access, a revenue-sharing structure for any commercial development on adjacent land, a direct purchase option for the rail corridor parcel at 3 times current market value, and a partnership stake in the overall project that would give you passive income for the rest of your life." Russell paused for effect. Harold tightened a bolt. Mr. Crane, the total value of this package over 20 years is more money than most people in this county will see in 5 lifetimes. You could retire tomorrow. You could travel. You could do whatever you want. Harold set down the wrench. He picked up a different wrench. He said without turning around, "You're offering to buy the future of this county with money." Russell blinked. "I'm offering a partnership." Partnership means both sides have something to lose. What do you have here, Mr. Tate? An office, a house, a family. You have a rented car and a laptop. If this project fails, you drive back to Omaha and start the next one. If it fails for the people here, they can't drive anywhere. They're already here. This is all they have. Russell closed the laptop slowly. He studied Harold's back, oil-stained shirt, the gray hair curling over the collar, the hands that had not stopped moving throughout the entire conversation. He was recalibrating. He had expected a negotiation. What he was getting was a philosophy. What would it take, Mr. Crane? Everyone has a number. Harold turned around for the first time. He looked Russell Tate in the eyes. "Come back when you have a better question." Russell left. Harold went back to the combine header. But something in the garage had shifted. Not in the room itself, but in the air between the walls, a tension that had not been there before, the kind of tension that precedes a decision from which there is no return. Over the next 2 days, Heartland Meridian made their presence felt in ways that had nothing to do with Harold directly. Russell Tate and his associates visited every farm within 3 miles of the town center. They knocked on doors. They sat at kitchen tables. They showed projections and timelines and artists' renderings of what Colton County could become if their project went through. They offered to buy land at prices that seemed extraordinary to people who had spent the last 5 years watching those same acres lose value every quarter. 3 families signed letters of intent within 48 hours. 2 more were considering it. The word around town shifted from curiosity about Harold to frustration with him. At the grain elevator, a farmer named Vern Hollis said out loud what others were thinking: "One man is blocking a deal that could save this whole county." "How is that right?" His wife, standing next to him, added. "We don't owe Harold Crane anything. He fixed our tractor, we paid him. That's business. This is something else." Harold heard about these conversations the way he heard about everything through the men who came to his garage. But for the first time, the men who came were not telling him their problems. They were telling him he was the problem. A farmer named Lyle Jessup came in with a starter motor issue on a Wednesday and said while Harold worked, "I'm not telling you what to do, Harold, but people are saying things, saying you're holding up progress for your own reasons. I don't believe that, but I wanted you to know what's out there." Harold replaced the starter motor. He charged Lyle $12 for parts and nothing for labor. Lyle stood in the doorway for a moment after paying, wanting to say something more, but Harold had already moved to the next machine. That night, Harold sat at the kitchen table and did something he had not done in years. He took out a sheet of paper and wrote a list, not of land parcels or debt amounts or auction dates. A list of names, every person in Colton County who had ever trusted him with a machine, a secret, a worry, a tear. The list was long. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and went to bed. He would carry that list for the rest of the week, touching it occasionally through the fabric the way a man touches a wallet to make sure it is still there. Not because the list had value, because it reminded him what he was fighting for when the town was telling him to stop. The better question came 3 days later, but it did not come from Russell Tate. It came from Margaret Hollis. She arrived at the garage at closing time, 6:30 in the evening, when the light was fading and the last customers had gone. She was not there for car trouble. She was wearing the expression of a woman who had driven across town rehearsing a speech and was now going to deliver it whether the audience wanted to hear it or not. Harold, I'm going to be direct with you because I think we're past the point of small talk. Harold was standing at the open garage door, one hand on the chain that pulled it down for the night. He let go of the chain but did not close the door. He leaned against the frame and waited. The Heartland Meridian project represents the most significant economic opportunity this county has seen in 40 years. If it goes through, property values rise, the tax base expands, the bank stabilizes, and this town survives. If it doesn't go through, we continue the same decline we've been in for a decade. More farms close, more families leave, more storefronts go dark. She paused. Harold crossed his arms but said nothing. I've reviewed your acquisitions, all cash purchases at public auction or private sale. Legally clean as far as I can tell. But Harold, you bought most of that land during a period of extreme financial distress in this county. Auctions where sellers were desperate and buyers were scarce. A motivated attorney could argue that several of those transactions involved unconscionable pricing or informational asymmetry. Harold turned around. Unconscionable pricing, he repeated. I'm not saying I believe it, I'm saying someone could argue it. Someone like Heartland Meridian's legal team. Margaret did not confirm or deny. She held his gaze. I'm saying that holding on to all 7 parcels and blocking a project that could save this county is a decision that has consequences. Legal consequences. Social consequences. I'm here as someone who has lived in this county for 20 years telling you to think carefully. Harold dried his hands on a rag. He folded it, once set it on the workbench, and then said something that Margaret Hollis would remember for the rest of her career. You sold me 4 of those parcels, Margaret. Your bank, your auctions, your signature on the transfer documents. If anyone argues that those prices were unconscionable, the first question a judge will ask is why the bank accepted them. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. You want to review my paperwork? Go ahead. But you'll be reviewing your own paperwork at the same time, and I don't think corporate would enjoy that kind of attention. Margaret stood motionless for 5 seconds. Then she turned, walked to her car, and drove away without another word. Harold locked the garage. His hands were steady. His pulse was not. He had won that exchange, but he was not foolish enough to think it was over. Margaret would not come at him directly again. But Heartland Meridian had resources that Margaret did not: lawyers from firms that specialized in land use disputes, eminent domain challenges, access easement litigation. Harold's deeds were clean. His prices were fair. His paperwork was meticulous. But meticulous paperwork was a shield, not a fortress. It could hold for a while. It could not hold forever against unlimited money. The next move came 2 days later, and it was aimed not at Harold but at Glenn Harker. Glenn told Harold about it over coffee at the garage the following morning. Glenn had received a visit from Russell Tate, polite and professional, requesting that the sheriff's department conduct a routine compliance review of agricultural properties in the county, specifically properties that had changed ownership multiple times in the past decade, specifically properties owned by individuals who were not actively farming the land. He didn't say your name, Glenn said. He didn't have to. Harold poured Glenn a second cup from the pot he kept on the file cabinet. What did you tell him? I told him I'd look into it, which I did. I looked into it for about 45 minutes, determined that all your properties are classified correctly and in compliance with county zoning, and filed a report that says exactly that. Glenn set down his cup. His face changed. The casual authority of a county sheriff was still there, but underneath it was something more personal, the concern of a man who had known Harold since they were both 17 and sitting in the back row of Mrs. Patterson's history class. Harold, these people aren't going to stop. Tate was polite, but there was something behind the politeness, the kind of patience that comes from having a budget for patience. They will find a pressure point eventually. Might be legal, might be political, might be something nobody's thought of yet. I can run interference on the small stuff, but I can't protect you from a company that has more lawyers in this county has people. Harold looked at Glenn. I'm not asking you to protect me. I know you're not. That's what worries me. Glenn left. Harold sat at the workbench and thought about what Glenn had said. Pressure points. Everyone had them. Harold's was not legal exposure or financial need. Harold's pressure point was simpler and more dangerous than either of those things. Harold's pressure point was that he was alone. He had no family standing with him, no allies, no organization. He had Tommy, who was still trying to understand what was happening, and he had Glenn, who was limited by the boundaries of his office, and he had Dale Perkins, who was not speaking to him. One man holding 7 deeds against a corporation with offices in 3 states. The math was not in his favor. It had never been in his favor. The only advantage Harold had ever possessed was time, and Heartland Meridian was working to take that away. That night, Tommy asked the question. They were sitting in the kitchen after dinner. Tommy had cooked badly because Harold's cooking was worse, and someone had to do it. The plates were cleared. The table was empty except for 2 glasses of water and the silence that had become the third resident of the house. Uncle Harold, can I ask you something and get an actual answer? Harold nodded. Why don't you sell? You could take the money, leave this town, live anywhere. You've worked your whole life. You've earned it. You could rest. Harold leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling, then at the window, then at his nephew. For a long moment he said nothing, and Tommy thought the conversation was over before it started. Then Harold spoke. Slowly, carefully, the way he spoke when every word was being selected. The way he selected tools precisely and for a specific purpose. After we lost the farm, your grandfather used to drive it out to the old place every night. Park on the county road. Sit in the truck with the engine off. Just look at the house through the fence. Tommy had never heard this. His mother had never mentioned it. Every night, for a year, he'd sit there for an hour, sometimes 2, looking at the fields he used to work, the house he used to live in, the life he used to have, all of it on the other side of a fence he wasn't allowed to cross anymore. Harold paused. His voice had not cracked, but it had lowered to a register Tommy had never heard before, the frequency of a man speaking from a place he normally kept sealed. He died sitting in that truck. The doctor said heart failure, but I was there, Tommy. I saw his face. He didn't die of heart failure. He died of standing on the wrong side of the fence. Harold looked at his nephew directly. I'm not going to stand on the wrong side, not for money, not for comfort, not for anything they can offer me. I'm going to stay on my land, and I'm going to die on my land, and nobody is going to put a fence between me and what's mine. Tommy did not respond for a long time. Then he said quietly, what about Dale's land? Is that yours too? Harold's eyes shifted. He looked at the table, at the glass of water, at anything except Tommy. I mean, you bought it. Tommy continued, his voice not accusatory but searching. You said you buy to keep, but keep for who? Harold did not answer, and his silence was louder than anything he had said all evening, because it was the silence of a man who had asked himself the same question every night since March, and still did not have an answer he could live with. Russell Tate came to the garage one last time on a Friday afternoon in late April. He came alone. No laptop, no spreadsheet, no associates waiting in the car. He walked in and sat on the stool and waited until Harold finished what he was working on, which took about 10 minutes because Harold was not going to rush for anyone. Last visit, Mr. Crane. After this, we either have a deal or we don't. Harold wiped his hands. He turned to face Russell, not from across the room, not from under a tractor, but face to face, standing 3 feet apart. Russell spoke plainly. Our board has authorized a final offer, a direct purchase of all 7 parcels at a price that would make you one of the wealthiest individuals in the state of Nebraska. I'm not going to name the number because you're going to tell me the number doesn't matter. And you'd be right because I've spent enough time in this garage to understand that about you. So instead, I'll tell you what happens if you say no. Harold listened. If you say no, we buy every piece of land around your parcels. We build access roads that bypass your property. We petition the county for easement modifications. We file legal challenges on drainage rights and rail corridor access. It will take years. It will cost us millions. But we'll do it because the project is worth more than the fight. And in the end, Mr. Crane, you'll be an old man sitting on land that's surrounded on all sides by a company that has made it very clear you're not welcome. You'll have won the battle, but you'll spend the rest of your life inside a fortress that nobody visits. Russell let the words settle. He was not bluffing. He was describing a future that was entirely within Heartland Meridian's capability to create. So I'm asking you one more time, what do you want? The garage was silent, not the temporary silence of a conversation pausing, but the deep silence of a space holding its breath. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air. On the back wall above the transmission fluid, the photograph of Virgil Crane watched from another decade. And Harold remembered. He remembered Earl Dawson sitting on the oil drum, weeping. He remembered Hank Leary being led out of the bank with his fists still clenched. He remembered Barb Kingsley saying, "You're the only person who didn't try to make me feel stupid." He remembered every farmer who had walked through that garage door carrying more fear than he could hold, talking to the only man in the county who would listen without judgment. He remembered Dale, the lunches, the silence that was not empty but full, the look on Dale's face in the frozen auction yard. And he remembered his father sitting in a truck in the dark looking through a fence at a life that no longer belonged to him. Harold Crane looked at Russell Tate and said 5 words. "I'm not selling, not 1 acre." Russell did not move. He waited the way a man waits for the second part of a sentence that he is certain must be coming at a condition, a caveat, a price that has not yet been named. But there was no second part. There was no condition. There was only Harold Crane, 56 years old, standing in a garage that smelled like decades of diesel and repair work, telling a man who represented more money than the entire county was worth that the answer was no. "You understand what I just described," Russell said. "The legal challenges, the isolation, the years of pressure." "I understand." "And your answer is still no." "My answer has been no since before you got here, Mr. Tate. It was no before you came to this county. It was no when I bought the first parcel in 1978. It was no every morning I opened this garage for 30 years. You just didn't know who to ask." Russell Tate stood up. He straightened his shirt. He looked around the garage at the tools on the pegboard, the oil drum, seats, the cracked concrete floor, and the man who owned more strategically valuable land than some regional banks and still changed his own oil. He shook his head once, not in anger, but in something closer to bewilderment, the expression of a man encountering a species of stubbornness he had not previously believed existed. He walked out without shaking hands. Harold heard the sedan pull out of the gravel lot and turn east toward the highway, toward Omaha, toward the offices where the men who thought they could buy a county would have to explain why they couldn't. Harold picked up the wrench and went back to work. Inside Heartland Meridian's regional office, the aftermath was loud and ugly. Harold never saw it, but the county heard about it through the grapevine of small-town intelligence that connects everything to everything. Russell Tate's projections were challenged. His team was blamed. Budget overruns were scrutinized. The board convened an emergency session. Every major route the project needed crossed Harold's land. The rail corridor, the highway access, the drainage easements, the north intersection. Rerouting was possible in theory, but catastrophic in practice. The cost of bypassing Harold's 7 parcels would add so much to the budget that the project's return on investment fell below the threshold the board had set. The numbers no longer worked. Margaret Hollis received a call from Heartland Meridian's finance director, informing her that the project timeline was under review, which was corporate language for dead. She hung up the phone and sat in her office, looking at the foreclosure files she had pushed through the previous quarter. 12 families, 12 names. She had processed them to make the county's land inventory attractive to a buyer who was now leaving. The inventory was useless. The families were still gone. Kevin Marsh knocked on her door that afternoon and asked if there was anything she needed. Margaret looked at him for a long time and said, "Start a file on forbearance options for next quarter." Kevin did not ask why. He simply nodded and went to his desk. 1 month after Harold refused the final offer, a truck pulled into the garage parking lot at 11:30 in the morning. Harold recognized the engine before he saw the vehicle. It was a sound he had listened to 1,000 times, the particular rattle of Dale Perkins' old Dodge, with the loose heat shield that Harold had offered to fix a dozen times, and Dale had refused a dozen times because he said the rattle was how his wife knew he was coming home. Harold was under a tractor. He slid out on the creeper and stood up. Dale was standing at the garage door. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He was thinner than the last time Harold had seen him. His face had aged in a way that 2 months should not have been able to produce. Neither man spoke for a long time. The garage held the silence the way the earth holds rain after a drought, absorbing it slowly, letting it soak into the cracks. "I heard you didn't sell," Dale said finally. Harold wiped his hands. "I didn't sell." Dale turned the hat once more. His jaw worked the way a man's jaw works when he is chewing on words that taste like pride and humiliation and relief all at the same time. "The 400 acres, my family's land. The north parcel." Dale stopped turning the hat. "What are you planning to do with it?" Harold walked to the workbench. He opened the second drawer, the one that had held the 6 deeds Tommy found weeks ago. But this time he pulled out a different document. A single sheet of paper typewritten with a date at the top that was older than the question Dale was asking. He held it out. Dale took it. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something when he is afraid of what it might say and more afraid of what it might not. It was a lease agreement, long-term, 20 years with an option to renew. The lessee was Dale Perkins. The annual rent was $1. The terms specified that Dale would farm the land as he saw fit, maintain the property, and retain all proceeds from any crops grown on it. The lessor was Harold Crane. The date on the lease was March 8, 1985, the day Harold had bought Dale's land at auction. He had written it that night, before the whiskey, before the darkness, before the 3 days of silence. Harold had come home from the auction holding a deed that had cost him his only friend, and the first thing he had done was sit down at the kitchen table and write a lease that would give the land back. Not the ownership, the use, the right to work the soil, to plant, to harvest, to live on the land as if it were still his. Because Harold had never intended to farm Dale's 400 acres. He had never intended to develop them or sell them or hold them as an investment. He had bought them for one reason only: to keep them out of Heartland Meridian's hands, to close the circle, to make sure that when the men from Omaha came, they would find no gap, no entry point, no weakness in the ring of ownership that Harold had spent 20 years constructing. And then once the circle was secure, to give the land back to the man it belonged to. Not legally. Legally, it belonged to Harold and would belong to Harold for as long as he lived. but in every way that mattered to a farmer, in the right to work it and live from it and pass the knowledge of its soil to the next generation. The land was Dale's. Dale read the lease twice. His hands were not steady. He looked up at Harold with eyes that contained something too complicated for a single word: anger and gratitude and shame and love, and the particular pain of realizing that the person who hurt you the most was also the person who had been protecting you the entire time. "You wrote this the day you bought it," Dale said. "Yes." "Before I came to the garage, before I said what I said." "Yes." Dale's chin dropped to his chest. He stood that way for 10 seconds, 20, 30. When he raised his head, his eyes were red, but his voice was clear. He did not say thank you. He did not say I forgive you. He did not say I understand. He folded the lease, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked to his truck. He opened the passenger door and took out a brown paper bag. Inside were 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, and 2 bottles of water. He set the bag on the workbench, pulled up the oil drum, and sat down. Harold sat on the other oil drum. They ate in silence. The sandwiches were ham and cheese on white bread, the same thing Dale's wife had been making for 15 years. The apples were small and slightly bruised, the kind you get from a tree in the backyard that nobody has pruned in a decade. The water was room temperature. It was the best meal Harold Crane had eaten in his life. Within 2 years, Heartland Murding Corporation formally withdrew from Colton County. The announcement was buried in a quarterly report that nobody in the county read a single line about strategic reallocation of development resources to higher yield markets. The office in Omaha reassigned Russell Tate to a project in Kansas. The banner came down. The black SUVs did not return. The county changed after that, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the slow and layered way that places change when the people in them start to see each other differently. Harold Crane did not become a celebrity. He did not give interviews. He did not attend the county board meetings where his name was mentioned with increasing frequency. He did not change a single thing about his daily routine. He still fixed machines that other mechanics would have sent to the scrapyard. He charged what people could afford, which was often less than the parts cost him, and sometimes he did not charge at all. But the town knew now. They knew what he had done, and they knew, more importantly, what he had chosen not to do. He had been offered enough money to leave Colton County behind forever, and he had said no. He had said no for them, even though most of them had spent 30 years pretending he did not exist. People started coming to the garage to shake his hand, to ask his advice, to simply stand near a man who could not be bought. Harold accepted the handshakes and ignored the advice requests and kept working. He was not comfortable with admiration. He had spent his entire adult life calibrating his existence to avoid attention, and the sudden visibility felt like standing in a room where someone had turned on too many lights. But Tommy noticed something Harold did not. He noticed that Harold's shoulders had dropped half an inch, that the line between his eyebrows, the one that had been etched there for as long as Tommy could remember, was slightly less deep. That Harold, for the first time since Tommy had arrived in Colton, occasionally looked out the garage window at the fields and did not seem to be calculating anything. He was just looking. Tommy did not leave. He had planned to. He had arrived in Colton with a backpack and a bus ticket and a private certainty that this was a temporary stop, a place to sleep and eat until he figured out where he was actually going. But the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into something else, and Tommy found that the rhythm of the garage had gotten into him the way oil gets into the grain of a workbench, slowly and permanently. He started showing up before dawn, not because Harold asked him to. Harold would never ask. Tommy showed up because he had watched a man hold the entire future of a county in his hands and give it back. and he wanted to understand how a person became capable of that. He learned to read a hydraulic system by feel. He learned that the sound a piston makes when it is failing is different from the sound it makes when it is merely tired. He learned that most people who bring a broken machine into a repair shop are not really there about the machine. They are there because something else in their life is broken and the machine is the only thing they have permission to admit is wrong. He learned to listen. One afternoon in July, a young farmer named Wyatt Gibbs brought in a hay baler with a sheared flywheel key. Wyatt was 23, newly married, farming 80 acres he had leased from the county land trust. He was nervous and talked fast the way men talk when they are afraid the repair will cost more than they can pay. Tommy was alone in the garage. Harold had driven to Kearney for parts. Tommy looked at the baler, identified the problem, and spent 3 hours machining a replacement key from a piece of scrap steel. When Wyatt asked how much, Tommy glanced at the man's boots, which were held together with duct tape, and said, $20 for the part, no charge for labor. Wyatt stared at him. That's not enough. It's enough, Tommy said. When Harold returned that evening, he found the $20 bill on the workbench next to a note in Tommy's handwriting. Gibbs hay baler, sheared flywheel key, replaced from scrap. Harold read the note. He looked at the $20. He looked at Tommy, who was sweeping the floor. Harold did not say, well done. He did not say, I'm proud of you. He picked up the $20 bill, put it in the cash box, and wrote the repair in the logbook. But when he closed the logbook, his hand rested on the cover for a moment longer than necessary, the way a man's hand rests on something when he is grateful but does not have the vocabulary for it. One evening in late summer, the garage was closed and Harold was sweeping the floor, which he did every night with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. Tommy was wiping down the workbench. Uncle Harold. Harold swept. Who are you going to leave the land to? Harold stopped sweeping. He looked at Tommy. It was a look that contained evaluation and memory and something that might have been hope, though Harold would never have called it that. Someone who knows how to keep it, Harold said. Tommy held his uncle's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he went back to wiping the workbench. He did not ask what keep it meant. He already knew. Keeping was not the same as owning. Owning was a piece of paper. Keeping was a way of living, a daily decision to stay, to maintain, to protect, to refuse the easy money and the comfortable exit, and the voice that whispered, there's something better somewhere else. Keeping meant choosing the dirt under your fingernails over the clean hands of a man who sold everything and went to the city. Tommy had started to understand that. Not fully, not yet. He was 19. But the understanding was taking root the way a seed takes root in soil that has been prepared for it silently beneath the surface in the dark where the important things happen. Fall came to Colton County. The corn was harvested. The fields went brown, then gray, then white with the first frost. Harold opened the garage every morning before sunrise and closed it every evening when the work was done. Dale Perkins brought lunch every day. 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, 2 bottles of water. They sat on the oil drums and ate without talking much, the way they had for 15 years before the rupture, and the way they would for however many years remained. The lease agreement was in Dale's filing cabinet at home. He had not framed it. He had not shown it to anyone. He simply went back to farming his 400 acres as if he had never left, because in every way that mattered, he hadn't. On a Tuesday morning in October, Harold arrived at the garage and found a note taped to the door. It was from Earl Dawson. The note said, Harold, I lost the farm, but I didn't lose everything. Thank you for listening when nobody else would. I got a job at the elevator in Grand Island. Martha and I are doing okay. I hope you're doing okay too. Harold read the note. He folded it carefully and put it in the top drawer of the workbench next to a cracked fitting from a John Deere 402. Oh, that he had never thrown away. A week later, a card arrived in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse. It read, "Dear Harold, I heard what you did, or rather what you didn't do. When you bought my 45 acres, I thought you were just another man with cash and no conscience. I was wrong. You kept the land here. That matters more than I knew at the time. Bill passed in September. He never knew about any of this, which is probably for the best. He would have been too proud to say thank you. I am not. Sincerely, Barb Kingsley." Harold read the card twice. He placed it in the drawer next to Earl's note in the cracked fitting. The drawer was becoming a small archive of the things people said to him when they finally understood what he had been doing. Harold did not keep the cards for sentimental reasons. He kept them because on the nights when the question returned, the question Tommy had asked the question, Dale's face had screamed in the frozen auction yard, the question Harold asked himself every time he looked at the map. Those cards were the only evidence he had that the answer might be something he could live with. The photograph of Virgil Crane still hung on the back wall. The edges were more curled now, the image slightly more faded. But the man in the photograph still stood in front of his farmhouse, still held his hat in one hand and shielded his eyes with the other, still looked out from the frame with the expression of a man standing on something that belonged to him. Harold understood now what his father had been looking at in that photograph. Not the house, not the field. Virgil Crane had been looking at the future and trying to hold it in place. The future had slipped through his fingers because the system was designed to take it from men like him. Harold had spent 40 years rebuilding what his father lost. Not the specific land, but the principle underneath it that a man could own the ground he stood on, and no one could get it away if he was patient enough and quiet enough and stubborn enough to hold on. He had not done it perfectly. He had lied to his best friend. He had bought land from desperate people. He had sat in a dark kitchen staring at a bottle of whiskey and wondering if he had become the thing he swore to fight. The cost of what he built was real, measured in loneliness and moral weight and 3 days when the garage did not open. But the land was still there, and so was he, and so was the town. On a Friday morning in November, Harold Crane opened the garage at 5:15, same as always. The fluorescent lights buzzed and caught. The air smelled like motor oil and cold concrete. Tommy was already inside sorting wrenches on the pegboard, putting them in the order Harold had taught him, the order Harold had used for 30 years, the order that Harold's father might have used if Virgil Crane had been given the chance to build something instead of watching it disappear. An old pickup truck pulled into the lot. A farmer Harold had never met climbed out with a clutch problem and a worried expression. Harold poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to the man, and listened. Then he picked up a wrench and went to work. Outside, the fields of Colton County stretched flat and silent in every direction, frozen under the first hard frost of winter. The corn was in. The stubble was standing. The land was resting the way land does when it knows it is not going anywhere, patient and permanent and indifferent to the plans of men who thought they could own it. But one man did own it. The quiet mechanic who never raised his voice, never borrowed a dollar, never cared about looking important. The man who bought the ground beneath the future while everyone else was busy looking the other way. Harold Crane, the man nobody noticed. The man who owned everything.